was the webinar trainer from for Nik software. Wow, for Nik software from 2009 to 2014, basically. And I teach photography at the Rochester Institute of Photography. Wow, Rochester Institute of Technology in the photography school specifically. All right, that was a mouthful. We're talking about HDR photography. We are going to be actually specifically we're specifically going to be talking about HDR Efex Pro, and I want to show you how to launch the software from both Photo Lab and then utilizing Photoshop. If you're a Lightroom user, I primarily use Lightroom for the bulk of my sort of photo organization and a lot of raw processing that I do on my own photographs. I use different kinds of software depending upon the camera that I'm using to shoot, because different cameras are going to yield you different results in different raw processors. I find myself using Dxo Photo Lab 2 a good amount now because the color and the correction that occurs because of the camera and lens combination profile that Dxo has corrects a lot of issues that can occur, and it basically does it automatically. So you just download the module for the particular camera and lens that you're using, and it basically fixes some of the optical issues that you might have with that combination. Now, like I said before, feel free to type in any questions you might have. I've actually minimized the GoToWebinar control panel, so I can't see if you guys are typing in. And if you are, I'm going to check every few minutes, but forgive me if I miss a question, and I maybe save it for the end until the Q&A after the actual presentation itself. So let's go ahead and get started talking about HDR Efex Pro. And as we do this, we should probably discuss a little bit of what HDR photography is. So I have a couple different exposure series that we're going to be utilizing for this demonstration. I'm also going to show you some of the things that you can do with the tool set on a single image, because you don't have to merge multiple images together to utilize HDR Efex Pro. Now, if you want to create a high dynamic range image, technically you have to shoot a series of images in a situation where the camera can't capture the full dynamic range of the photograph in a single capture. So this is a situation where I've overexposed the scene so that I can make sure and get shadow detail basically with everything in the scene. And then I run a bracket of exposures. And forgive me if you're an expert in this or you've done this a lot. I imagine there are folks who've never shot HDR or are new to it. So I just want to explain it a little bit. So the series here allows me to capture the full range of tones that are within this exposure series. Now, my sort of speculars, these light posts are still, or the head on the light, are still basically blown out. It says that we have detail in them according to the histogram here, but they're pretty bright, and I'm going to leave them that way. But I've basically shot a whole bunch of exposures here to make sure I've got detail in the brightest value of the building, and inside and out, as well as the darkest value within the building and the scene itself. And we know that looking at the histogram. So this is the brightest exposure, and so basically we're going to be able to utilize the darkest bit of information. We'll be able to control all of that information when we merge these images together. And the most overexposed image is going to allow us to control among the other exposures as well. We probably don't even need to use that last one according to this histogram. Basically this exposure would be the last exposure that we probably need to merge together to be able to manage and adjust the brightest values within our HDR image. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take all, 7 of these. I'm going to leave out one of them because I don't think I need the last one. I overshot this one, probably not paying really good attention to the histogram on the back of the camera while shooting the series, in attempts to shoot the series as quickly as possible. But basically, I want to take all of these images into HDR Efex Pro. Before I would do that, I would make sure I have any lens correction tools on that I'd want to use. I might do some pre-sharpening utilizing the raw processor, and I might do noise reduction. But I don't want to make any kinds of aggressive contrast adjustments or anything like that. In fact, if my smart lighting is on right now, I probably should turn that off. I'll leave my white balance on, and my crop I don't have to worry about. But you can see if I turn this on and off, this DxO smart lighting algorithm, which is a really splendid tool, is basically going to shift the tones in this image. I don't really want to do that in the initial series in this case, because I want to basically retain as much information from the raw file and then merge and control the image throughout HDR Efex Pro. Sorry, I should make sure to phrase that properly. So I'm turning off the DxO smart lighting here within Photo Lab 2. If I were within Lightroom or within Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, that is, I would maybe make these same kinds of adjustments: noise reduction, sharpening, lens corrections, white balance. When I'm happy with that result, I basically need to highlight all of these raw files right here and bring them into HDR Efex Pro. Now, these are full resolution raw files. They were shot on a D700, so they're only 12 megapixels, but it will take us a second, as I've highlighted all of the images, to go into HDR Efex Pro and to merge the initial image. And I'll show you why in just a second. But to access HDR Efex Pro, you click the Nik Collection button. That's here in the lower right corner of the Photo Lab interface. Your plugin selector dialog opens. And to open HDR Efex, you click HDR Efex Pro 2. Actually, before I do that, I want to just look at some settings really quickly to kind of explain some things if you have never seen this before. In fact, what I'm going to do is click the settings button, which is at the bottom of the plugin selector. What Photo Lab has to do is copy these raw files and make them into TIFF files, and then those TIFF files will be launched into HDR Efex. So that said, when I click the OK button and I click the HDR Efex Pro 2 button, any of these settings will be applied to the image. And I bring that up because I want this action to take place for the highest potential quality HDR image. And that is, I want to process as a TIFF file. So I would want this setting on. I want my quality to be set to 16-bit. 8-bit is going to work much, much faster, but I'm going to be potentially losing information as we go into HDR Efex Pro. 300 DPI or PPI is actually fine. This could be adjusted depending upon how you plan to output your image. If you are someone who prints images, 300 PPI is probably good. If you have a particular workflow with a particular printer, you might actually change this resolution depending upon how you output your image. And then if you only work with posting images on the web, you could actually probably change this to 72 PPI and have a slightly faster workflow, hypothetically, and then also not have to worry about changing that when uploading to your favorite website or your social media posts or whatever you might use your images for. Enable resizing, I'm going to leave that off, but you can change the size from whatever is within Photo Lab that gets posted or brought into the Nik collection. So you could actually resize your images before going into the Nik collection, which is handy if you're going to use Sharpener Pro for output purposes. Advanced ICC profile. I'm just going to leave it as shot. I'm pretty sure that this was actually shot sRGB, and that's going to work well for web purposes. And you're viewing it on the web, so I'll just leave it as that. So I'm going to click the OK button. Then I'm going to click HDR Efex Pro 2. And now it's going to take a minute because basically, as you can see, there's a little icon to the lower right of each one of these avatar images, or the little thumbnails in the bottom. What's happening are those raw files, they're going to be duplicated into TIFF files, and then the TIFF files are going to open into HDR. As I mentioned before, you can see a little progress bar down in the lower right corner, and then basically we're going to open into HDR Efex, and we'll get an initial high dynamic range image at its sort of default. And this is where we'll be kind of launching. All right. So there's a few questions about HDR photography in here. I'm going to save those for the end of the webinar. And then looks like there's a few specific questions about the software. I'm going to save those as well, because now we're open into the merge dialog. And actually, in the merge dialog, we're getting a little warning saying the metadata of one or more of the images is different from other images in the series. This might reduce the quality. So This was unintended on my part. We should figure out what's going on here. But before I click cancel in the lower right corner, I'll just describe what's happening in this window, and then we'll go back over, and hopefully I don't have to spend a whole bunch more time. I probably left a setting on or something. Long story short, what we're looking at here is all of the exposures that we've brought in this sort of thumbnail up at the top. It looks like a little film strip. What's kind of important to us is the number that is in between each of these little settings here. And actually you can see that when I shot this exposure series, I apparently did not change my exposure by a standard full stop, at least not in this case, because this 5789 is -1/3 of an exposure. And what's happening, so software is sort of choosing the middle exposure, and it's saying that that's 0. That's what the correct exposure is for the scene, if you will. As you shoot your exposure series, you're going to be underexposing. This one goes down to 2 2/3 stops, and this goes up to basically the same, but in the positive, right? Brightening the exposure. So this is just an indicator and a little bit of information with the name of your file. You have a little preview, actually a large preview here, which is really quite nice, and then a slider. And mind you, this little slider here, this doesn't actually change anything in your merge. What this slider does is it's an indicator. It shows you what the full range of exposure is that you have within your exposure series, meaning as I slide it all the way to the right, we see the brightest representation of the image. If I slide it all the way to the left, you see the darkest representation of the image. So you can expect that when we merge the image, we're going to have all of that information to work with. Now, this little preview, or sorry, I keep saying that, it's a large preview, also does another thing. It is an indicator if we have any sort of ghost artifacts, and then it allows us to remove chromatic aberrations. So I'm not going to go into exclusive detail about these right now, but basically these 3 settings allow you to align the images. This was actually shot on a tripod, so I probably don't even need the alignment algorithm on. The ghost reduction allows you to remove any ghost artifacts that are occurring. So something like this. So if I actually click on the little magnification glass here, and then I click and drag over, you can see that I have a tourist here who's taking a picture, and she's actually kind of a ghost. I think I can get rid of that by moving into the ghost reduction tool. I actually didn't try and get rid of it when I was creating the demo because I like the ghost being there. But basically what you'll do is you'll turn this little checkbox on, and then you'll go into the ghost reference image, and you can decide which image the artifact may be coming from, or sorry, the ghost artifacting would be. Wow, see, I can't get rid of it actually. She must have been standing there for quite a bit, although she's not moving at all. So that's funky. There we go. So as I click into my different ghost reference images, basically what's happening is I'm saying I want anything, anything that is moving in the frame will be referenced from this photograph. So in this case, we're getting rid of that ghost artifact. We actually have some other like blurred folks here, but that doesn't bother me at all. These 3 were actually here the entire time. I think that they're helpful for the exposure. But if you want to get rid of any ghost artifacts that might be occurring, you click that checkbox on, and then you choose your ghost reference image, and then you can even change the strength of that. The higher the strength, the more reduced your potential exposure range could be. So if you can get away with not doing ghost reduction, I would advise that, because it can actually limit your overall quality. That's not always the worst. And if you have ghosts that are occurring because of the movement in the exposure series, you need to get rid of them oftentimes, so you do use it. But it's kind of like noise reduction. If I can get away with not using it, I'm gonna not use it if I can help it. The chromatic aberration tool, I don't find myself using very much either. If we were using HDR Efex Pro 2 as a standalone, because you can actually launch exposure series into HDR Efex Pro as a standalone, this might be helpful. Because I'm using Photo Lab 2 in this case, and it actually gets rid of the chromatic aberrations that occur because of lens and sensor combinations and so on, and contrast levels and stuff like that, I don't have to worry about it. Now, what I do have to worry about, I'm going to click the cancel button because I want to figure out what's happening with our error here, this warning that we're getting. It's probably not the worst thing in the world, but I have a feeling that in 85, I must have left a setting on, or something is not jiving properly. I wonder if the white balance is different. Oh, my white balance wasn't even on. That's probably what it was. So I probably actually don't even have to worry about it because the white balance adjustment would have been there. Oh, well, I also clicked on the wrong file. I don't see any specific differences. And in my demo, when I made this, that wasn't occurring. Let's actually see what happens. Turn the white balance off when we merge these images. So now that we've got the TIFF files, we should be able to just launch these files directly into HDR Effects. Let's see if there's any sort of quality problems. That's all of them. Okay, Nick Collection, HDR Efex Pro. Looks as though it's probably actually making another copy. That seems odd as well. Let's see how this works. So we're going to go back into the merge dialog. We hopefully don't get that error again. It does look like we're getting the error. Cool, of course, this is what's going to happen. I do want to turn on my ghost reduction. I'm going to go ahead and choose the 2 stops overexposed scene because I know that's the one that worked a minute ago. All right, let's click the Create HDR button. And let's just see what happens. Because of course, when we go live, somehow the demo goes funky. Now, we're going into HDR Efex Pro. I want to start by like walking through the interface itself, and then we're going to talk about all of the tools within the software. So we'll start on the left side of the interface, and this is where you have a collection of presets that are built directly into the software. You can actually create your own presets as well, and I would highly suggest that as you start to get to know HDR Efex Pro and you create a look in a combination of tools that you really like, save it as a preset so that you can create that same effect again, but without having to do all of the work. So we're in the All section of the presets in the upper left corner, and this is literally all of the presets that are built in. There are highly stylized presets. This is incredibly stylized. Tinted structure, which actually I think for this exposure series in this particular scene, it actually works to have a little bit more of a stylized sort of situation. But at least in my opinion, of course. Now, we have very, this is graduated 1. We have very realistic looking presets, and there are some that are a little bit more stylized. And then there are some like this, which to me, this seems like a natural set of tones, but the color has been shifted pretty dramatically for an aesthetic effect. Now, if you find that you like one of these presets, here's warm texture. I kind of like warm deep. Let's go with that one. If you like one of these presets, you're good to go. You could just click the save button in the lower right corner and you're done. But there are definitely things that we can do to massage the image and to get a completely different look out of the photograph. In this case, I say we do move with this warm deep preset. We're going to move over to the right side of the interface in a second. I just want to kind of cover what these other tools are on the lower left section of the interface. So you have an area for custom presets. These would be the presets that you created yourself. This is a series of presets that I've created. Actually, several of these are built into the software now. So like you can create your own and save them, and then you can even export them as well. So if you follow my cursor to the lower left corner, I can export all of my custom presets. And I would do that to save presets that I would use on other computers, and or just to simply back up my presets. So if you create a look that you really like and you want to keep that for as long as humanly possible, it's a good idea to back that data up in case your computer crashes or your hard drive dies, or heaven forbid, any of those things happen. And you can back these things up so you don't have to recreate them afterwards. They're very small files as well, so you can keep them in the cloud, for example, very easily. If you have Google Drive or Dropbox or something like that, you could have your own folder, and it wouldn't take up much space because they're really tiny files. Each individual preset can be exported. So I showed you the export all button, but you can actually export individual presets. You can update presets. Like I could make changes to this preset and then update it by clicking that button in the lower right corner of the preset icon. And then you can get rid of presets if you don't want them anymore. You just click the little X that's in the upper left corner of the presets that you've created or the presets that you've imported. So I don't have any imported presets at this point, but if I did, they would be listed here. Now, the last thing that I want to show you here on the left side of the interface isn't very impressive right now because we haven't done much to the image, but this is the history state browser, and it actually records every single thing we do while we're in the software. So if I go ahead into the drama setting on the right side of the interface and I start messing around with that, you can see as that's recorded in the history browser. And then I can go into that history browser and actually step back. So if I needed to go back into a previous state, I can do that very quickly and very easily. There's a help button in the lower left corner that launches the DxO website, the FAQs website, and then there's a settings button so that you can actually change some of the settings within HDR Effects. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over those because I just realized it's 7:25, time's flying, and hopefully you're having a good time. But let's move into the rest of the interface. So we've covered our presets. I'm going to go ahead and hide the presets. There's a button in the upper left corner here. If I click on that, or if I click or hit the tab button on my keyboard, I can actually hide those windows on the left and on the right to yield a bigger screen for more real estate on a preview, so you can see the image. And that's really helpful, especially when you're using like a side-by-side preview. In this case, I'm clicking the compare button, and this is showing me the original HDR merge and the enhanced HDR merge. If I click on the split preview, it actually cuts the image down the middle. On the left is the original merge, and on the right is the enhanced, or where our current state is, our current look. And then if I click on a side-by-side preview, and then maybe even, I don't think it's going to make any difference if I hide that left or the right panel. Now I can compare my image on top, or sorry, let me rephrase that. On the top here, you have the original merge. On the bottom, you have the enhanced merge. If you click the little turn button, that's going to basically give you your original image on the left side. I think you get it. These are the previews. It's the way that you view your original image and your enhanced image. So moving over to the upper right corner of our interface, you have a zoom indicator and then a zoom button, so you can zoom into whatever percentage you want, which also opens up a navigator, so you can click and move around the image. Another way to move around the image is if you hold the space bar down. This gives you the hand tool, and you can go ahead and click and drag around the photo. It's another way of navigating around an image that's zoomed in. The last button here that we haven't talked about in terms of interface adjustments is the ability to change the background with this button here. So the button in the upper right corner just allows us to change the tone of the background from different tones of gray, from very, very light gray to a medium gray, sort of middle gray, 50%, and then nearly black. That might be completely black. The white isn't totally white, it is gray. I don't remember exactly the tone of which gray that is. Actually, someone out there might know though. All right, so because it's been a while since I've looked at the GoToWebinar control panel, I'm gonna go ahead and take a gander at that to make sure nobody's having any problems here. Okay, nope, looks like everybody still can see. Okay, good to go. I see a couple more comments and questions like about updating presets and some of those things. Again, I'm going to save those. So in the tone compression section here, let's get into this tools palette. We've been looking at this picture now for about 20 minutes. We haven't actually done anything with it aside from clicking on some presets. Let's do some stuff. So I want to talk about tone compression and method strength. This image isn't the best image to show you what tone compression does, but I will show you on this image and on the next exposure series. But tone compression basically is kind of the amount of the HDR, if you will. If you set the tone compression to the right, the image is actually going to look a lot more natural, but you'll have a very limited dynamic range, right? If I slide that tone compression slider to the left, you can see I have a lot of highlights. These bright values are really blown out. They're too bright. So what I would do is start sneaking that tone compression slider to the right until I like what I see on screen, and then I would also pay attention to the histogram in the lower right corner. In this case, HDR Efex Pro, it's a pretty important tool to be utilizing. So I'm going to increase my tone compression. If I bring it all the way over to 100%, I'm now saving all of the highlight detail there pretty nicely, and then I'm also really highly compressing the histogram so that you can see that we have all of the information. We're not losing any of it right now. I'm going to actually reduce this a little bit because it's going to yield me a little bit more of a natural feel. And then you can see I'm actually peaking or clipping some of my highlight detail. Looks like specifically in the red channel, because you can see that little spike in the red. I'm going to show you how to get rid of that using control points in a few minutes, but I'm going to leave it for now. So tone compression is basically how much compression of that histogram, how much compression of those pixels you're going to actually get out of HDR effects. The method strength, this slider actually controls kind of the aesthetic feel of the HDR method. So method strength, if I'm going to bring it up to 100% for demonstration purposes, I don't think I've ever actually left method strength up at 100% because at least for my taste, it tends to be a little bit too strong in most situations. But you have the power. You can do what you want. HDR method. These pertain to the different kinds of math, the different algorithms that go into merging these images and then displaying the image on screen. So long story short, you can change the HDR method, the depth, the detail, and the drama to create completely different looks. So it's not, you don't just get what you get out of HDR effects. You have the capability of creating any look or feel that you might want to. So I've set depth, detail, and drama all the way to the left. So we've got off, soft, and flat right now. I'm going to set detail to realistic and my drama to natural. This is going to yield us a more natural looking HDR image, less sort of stylized image. And the depth tool, let's go ahead and explain or look at that. So one of the problems that you can run into with the look of an HDR image, because it is compressing the full set of tones that you've captured, is that it has to figure out how to do that and still yield a good looking image without sort of losing the specifics or the sort of the character of the light, if you will. And so what this depth tool does is it basically allows us to control whether we want that flat monotonalistic look, monotonalistic look, or if we want our sort of shadow gradients and highlight gradients to have a little bit more character to them. So as I set this depth to strong and then jump over to flat, you can see a pretty dramatic difference. And again, it's entirely an aesthetic choice as to what you find that's going to work on your exposure series. You know, if you want the most realistic look, usually you can go with the normal setting, the realistic detail, and the natural look. But you can also go into something like the detail tool and change this. You can get super dramatic with something like grungy. And I will say, I've never left my settings like this on my own image. It probably will work with several kinds of different kinds of photographs and for different aesthetic purposes. But one thing I have done is left this on normal, grungy, and something drama like maybe dingy or deep. But usually I would reduce my method strength if I'm going to do that. And so I still yield this look. You know, I still get that cool looking, highly stylized HDR image, but it's maybe dialed back a little bit. And again, to each his own, but I want to make sure that you say, oh, I will never use that grungy detail setting. But, you know, you might. You just probably won't leave the method strength all the way up. And if anybody has used those settings, I would love to see what you guys are posting wherever you might be posting, whether it's Instagram or Flickr or your own personal website. Feel free to share that. And in fact, if you want me to, I can share that out with everybody just by copying and pasting your comment. Anyways, let's get into this HDR method. So we've covered the depth, the detail. I'm going to bring the detail back over to realistic for just a moment so that you can see the difference in the drama settings. Right now I'm in flat, which is all the way over to the left. As I click into the different drama settings, again, what we're adjusting here is how the software displays this HDR merge. So we have all of these different choices, sharp and grainy. Now, grainy looks pretty interesting on this image, and granted, method strength's up pretty high, but you say, oh, well, look at how much noise is being accentuated in the sky. And in fact, what I would say is look at how much noise is being accentuated in these low frequency areas. The areas where there's really like high details and textures, it's not that noticeable, and the texture actually looks really beautiful. But it doesn't look so good up here. What you can do, I'm going to skip over tonality and color right now, by the way. And we're going to move right into control points because these are one of the most important tools in the software, and I focus on them a lot because they're fantastic. And what they allow you to do is basically control different portions of your image, or you can control selective areas and objects in your image by just placing a point on the object that you want to adjust. Now, in each of these points, you have control over exposure, contrast, saturation, structure, the blacks, the whites, temperature, and tint, and then method strength. So in this case, if I want to get rid of the noise that's being accentuated because of our choices in the HDR method section, I can take my method strength down basically until I get rid of that look, right? And now I'm smoothing out the sky here, but we still have that sort of highly stylized set of tools being applied to the rest of the image. Now, I want that exact same effect. I want to remove the method strength from basically the whole sky. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this control point. We'll talk more about how these control points are making their selections, but I want to basically duplicate this control point, place it in the other areas in the sky. So to do that very quickly, I just hold the Option key down on my keyboard. That's on a Mac, of course. If you're on a PC, that would be Option Control, is it? I forgot, Alt. It would be Alt. You'd hold the Alt button and then click and drag, and that's going to give you an exact duplicate of the control point that you've just clicked on and dragged away. So now we've reduced the method strength basically only in the sky. Now I may be affecting some other areas a little bit, but basically what the control point does is it looks for the object that you drop the point on, and then it allows you to control that object. Now the way that it makes its selection is it's looking for similar tones, colors, and textures that are inside of that point. So anything that's blue and of a similar texture and tone of the sky here that we place the point on, that falls inside of that circle, is going to be selected. We're not making a circular selection, at least in this case, but we are making a selection inside of the circle. The only time you'd really be making a circular selection is if I left a control point really small in this kind of area, or if we were attempting to make a selection of a basketball or something where the control point can recognize the edge of the ball or the object that you're trying to adjust. Now, to look at the selection that the control point is making, you move over to the right-hand side of the interface and you get a whole control points list. To go over that really quickly, on the left side of the control points list of each individual control point, you can toggle the effect of that control point on and off with this one checkbox. So off and then turning it back on. I know I'm affecting control point number 1 because it's highlighted here in the control point list and it's active in the image area itself. So I know I'm adjusting that particular one or looking at that particular one. Here we have the size of the area of influence. So right now it's set to 56% of the image, apparently. Yep. That makes sense. And then if I move over to the right side, this far right side, I can actually look at the selection that this control point is making. And what you're seeing here, as I click on that, is anything that's white is being selected completely. And then in this case, we're removing the method strength. Anything that's black is not being affected by this particular control point. I can actually see that this control point is affecting this area. You can probably see it as well. And what I want to do is maybe clean that up. So what I might do is take another control point, place that in this area, and that's basically going to start to clean up my selection. The more control points I add, the smarter each control point gets. And that's because each control point is communicating with the next and the previous and all of the other control points to try to figure out exactly what's being affected and what's not being affected. Now, I never really worry too much about these masks. What I end up doing is actually outside of the mask, just toggling the effect on and off. And if it's doing what I want the effect to do, if I'm getting the adjustment that I want, I don't really worry about going into and dialing in those masks all that much most of the time. I have to say that a lot of times when I'm explaining these things, I have to kind of generalize a little bit because it is, of course, image specific, and these control points work the same way on every image, but will have a kind of different amounts of a success rate. If I shot this in a situation with a lower ISO and I had all sorts of texture and detail and things, the control points are going to work perfectly. If I shoot a situation that's sort of monochrome, like in its inherent life situation. The control points, because they're looking for tone, color, and texture, they're probably not going to work as well. Like if I take a control point and I place it here in the highlight area here, this control point's probably going to work really well because it can find that area for us, and I can take that exposure down and we can start to get those tones. I think one problem that I'm running into here is that I'm not sure if that last image, the very brightest image that kind of gave us the error, or sorry, the very darkest image that kind of gave us that error, if that's working properly. So we might be, affected by this error because in the initial test that I did when I was sort of creating this presentation, I could actually get back all of this highlight information. So maybe we'll experiment with that after the actual presentation. For now, let's just take a quick look at the before and after. We're going to keep moving. This is the original image as we merged it. We used the tone compression settings as well as a bunch of control points and a preset to create our somewhat stylized HDR image here. I'm all done, so I'm going to go ahead and click the Save button in the lower right corner, and that's going to bring us back over into the host piece of software, in this case, Photo Lab 2, and we will have our sort of final merged image sitting in here with a boatload of copies of our TIFF files. Because apparently when I went to open those TIFFs, it actually copied them again. Our final HDR image here in our film strip in the bottom is set up right there. Very good. All right, let's keep moving. So I have one other exposure series that I want to launch into HDR Efex Pro. We're going to do this from Photoshop, and there's a few different ways that we can launch images into HDR Efex Pro from Photoshop. I could have all of the images open, and that's going to basically just work, right? So we'd have all the images open and I can add them. Or if I just go into the Nik selective tool here and I click the merge button, a little merge dialog, or rather the source file dialog is going to pop up. I can click the open button. So by the way, if the images were open already in Photoshop, I would just click add open files and they would be listed here. But since they're not, I'm going to click open, and we're going to go into this old interior, and let's see what happens if we launch these raw files. What should happen, what happened when I created this, is that the software would basically open, so Photoshop would open these raw files. They would use the XMP data that I've already set up, which again is adjusting the white balance, the sorry, sharpening and noise reduction and lens corrections, and it basically just worked. So let's see what happens right now when I click the merge dialog. I think what will happen is, again, it's going to generate TIFF files from these raw files, and it should launch into HDR Efex Pro 2. But seemingly we've already had a couple crazy things happen, so maybe some other crazy stuff might happen right now. Yep, writing the TIFF files. So this will take a while, actually. This exposure series was shot on a D800. These are raw files that have to be opened, and I believe, if I remember my my setup, I actually down-resed the files to 12 megapixels simply because when we're streaming the webinar, it's a little bit easier to use the smaller files so that we can see what's going on here, and it works a little bit quicker. Didn't mean to open Photo Lab 2. While this stuff is launching, let's see if we can take a look at some questions, because basically all of those images have to launch into Photoshop, and then HDR Efex Pro is going to launch. So I think we got a couple minutes here. Does the control point option include a feather of a selection of the image? Got it. So great question. The way the control point is making its selection, you don't have any kind of manual control over the edges or over how it's making the selection, other than sizing the area of influence. So I can show you what that does when you size the area of influence around something. And then also changing the tone, color, and texture that you've placed the point on. So literally just clicking and dragging your control point around is going to yield different results. And so sometimes it's when you'll place a control point, you'll make some adjustments. And it's not a bad idea to just drag the image or drag the control point around a little bit to see if there's 1, 2, 3. Is that working now? Hopefully, I wonder if, so it's indicating to me that my microphone is now on. Okay, it looks like we got it back. Okay, sorry about that, technical problem. I need to plug my actual microphone back in to see if it works. I don't know why that would have cut out that way. It's never happened before. Let's see if it recalibrates. All right, how about now? Use new, check. Okay, geez, okay, I'm sorry about that. We lost audio for a while. It seems like we're back on. Hopefully we didn't miss much. All right, I'm gonna try and recap what we just did. So I don't think we missed much because this thing was trying to crunch away and open up these images. Your microphone control panel is obscuring my view. Got it, Penelope. We should be set. So we've opened up these images. One of the questions that we got, and I was trying to answer, but I think my audio was cut out, was how many exposures do you need for a scene? In this case, because the dynamic range is so wide, we needed a number of different exposures because the brightness level of the room, the unlit interior, is so dark compared to the exterior, right? So in this case, this is practically a cave. This is the middle exposure. I'm going to actually turn this ghost reduction off because we don't need ghost reduction. But this exposure here in the middle of the film strip is what the camera says is, or the software says is the middle exposure. And then as we move to the most overexposed portion for shadow detail, you can see into, basically you can see into the fireplace there. Now, mind you, I have qualms with the way that this was shot. Like, I need you to escape or not think too much about some of the qualities of this. This is just a good exposure series for showing a couple different things. And so I found it to be helpful for tutorial purposes. But if we were to critique the images, I have some really major problems with this photo. But it does some cool stuff when we're in HDR Effects. So let's go ahead and click Create HDR. This time, rather than using a preset, we're going to start from scratch. We're going to use and create a relatively natural looking effect because the last image we had a highly stylized looking effect. And then we're going to sort of massage some of the exposure settings and then utilize control points so that we can control the tone and values within the photograph. The beauty of the control points in HDR Efex Pro is the fact that we can control tone, color, and texture, among other things, contrasts and color. Well, I already mentioned that. Texture, I guess, I don't know. In a 32-bit per channel space, which means the control points are utilizing all of the information within the exposure series. And that means we have, in this case, you know, a 16-stop difference between the brightest values and the darkest values. So it's pretty incredible. And we can control these things selectively. So we're here within HDR Effects. I'm going to leave my depth on normal, my detail on realistic, and my drama on natural. We probably could go in and get a slightly different but very natural looking effect from different settings, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. And then I do want to increase my tone compression. Again, if I bring it all the way to the right, it's going to smoosh the histogram, right? So now we don't have any bright values, and some of the shadows and highlights, it's looking really funky at this point. So I don't want to leave the tone compression up at 100. I'm going to leave the tone compression somewhere where I'm retaining highlight values, and I've got a nice sort of relatively dark shadow. Now, I don't have to worry too much about I don't have to worry too much about the selective areas here. Like, I want to darken down this area, and I want to brighten up the parts of the carpet. I don't have to worry about that right now. I want to worry about the whole global image on sort of average, because we're going to go in selectively and we're going to control the individual portions of the image using control points again. Now, moving into tonality, here's where we can control the overall exposure of the image, right? So I can kind of brighten up the whole value of the photograph. I can the entire density of the whole photo, I can bring that up in exposure. Shadows and highlights, I can control the the density of the shadows. I can brighten this up or darken them down, right? I'm going to do that selectively though, because I can use control points to control and direct the viewer's attention through the image. I can do this with highlights. I have a contrast control, or slider rather, and blacks and whites. Now, I don't want to mess too much with these because I think on average the image looks relatively natural. What I want to do is go in selectively and start controlling this. So the structure slider here, this tool is a texture adjustment. If I increase this, it's going to bring out any and all texture. You can really start to see some of the problems with the ceiling of this house. I'll mention this is actually the house that I grew up in. So it's kind of a museum to me, and this room has been completely redone since this picture was taken, so it's kind of a little bit of nostalgia for me. But I like what it does in terms of allowing us to show different tools, and you can see with the structure slider, as I'm bringing that up, you can see all of the parts of the ceiling that were patched and that are messed up now, and then you can start to see some of the issues with the wallpaper and so on and so forth, which is interesting. If you're an urbex photographer, this structure tool globally or selectively, really beautiful tool for bringing out textures. If you don't even have to be an urbex photographer, I'm just, I guess, stating in a generalization again. So the color section here, color, globally, you have control over the saturation, right? So we can bump that way up or dial that down. We have a temperature control. So if I didn't adjust my white balance exactly the way I needed it to be, I can actually adjust that here within HDR Efex Pro. I'm actually going to cool the image a little bit because now it looks slightly more neutral than it was. And then I'm going to move directly into control points because this is where this software really shines. Aside from having all of these sort of aesthetic capabilities and just being able to choose whatever you want, the beauty of this control point system here, I can go in and dodge the ceiling 15%, 10%, or whatever, anything I feel necessary, and then I can go and drop control points down here in the bottom portion of the carpet, and I can start darkening these values down and really starting to direct your attention as the viewer. So let's actually look at some of these control points and the selections the control points are making. And I know we're coming short on time. I've got a lot more to talk to you about. There is going to be another webinar on HDR Efex Pro later in the month. We're going to be talking about the tool set, but talking about workflows as well. So if I miss anything that you're interested in hearing about, you can ask it in the questions box, or if you have to head out because you only had the hour, you can absolutely, of course, do that. And then join us again for the webinar later in the month too. So talking about control points and the positioning of the control points, I'm going to hit Command plus 2 times here. It's going to zoom us in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and drop the control point on some of these values and just move them around. And as I do that, you can actually see the tones pretty dramatically change. I'm going to take the exposure way down, right? As I do that, you can see that we've got a lot of information in this tree that's outside of the window. You can actually almost tell that it's a cedar tree. And as I drag the control point around, depending upon where I place the point, I get a completely different effect, right? And it's doing that because when I drop this point, it's looking for similar tones, colors, and textures. And in fact, if we want to look at the selection the control point is making, again, you move over to the right side of the interface, click on this little checkbox here, and what you're seeing is anything that is white has the effect on it. Anything that is black doesn't. So this control point is literally selecting out only the brightest values that are outside of that window. And it's allowing us to control those values based upon the information that we have in our exposure series. As I click and drag my control point around, you see the selection shift and change. So this is it's a good example of how these control points are working. And it's a good example of when the control points work in a really controlled way, in a way that's going to give us the result that we're really expecting. Because like anything, the control points are absolutely, they work like magic practically. They're incredible. And they do work like this, but on certain images, in certain situations, you'll find you yield different results. It's a matter of just getting used to how the control points are working and then going in and controlling the image how you see fit. Anyways, I could go in with these control points all day and really start to hone this in. but we are running out of time. I do want to open up one more picture that is a single image exposure. I think all I'm going to do now is jump into the finishing adjustments and just add a really quick like lens vignette. I'll do the black frame number 1, and then I'm just going to go ahead and bring the effect down a little bit. I'm not going to add such a dramatic gradient around the edge. I'm going to click the OK button, and then it's going to bring us back over into Photoshop because that was the host software that we utilized. And it's going to generate our sort of separate TIFF file. As it's doing that, I'm going to jump into the GoToWebinar control panel. Okay. The clarity of the slider. Is there a clarity slider or is it the same as structure? Good question. So the clarity structure that's within the Nik collection is not the same as, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. The structure slider that's within the Nik collection is not the same as the clarity slider that you find within Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. It will yield you a completely different result. And I say it that way because you can use them in combination. So you can use, let's say, clarity after you've merged your HDR image and utilize the structure tools. I will say, in the raw process, I would avoid using the clarity tool to individual images, to individual images that are in an exposure series. I wouldn't adjust too many of those things because it can throw off the system, if you will. So what I would do if I wanted to utilize clarity with the HDR Efex Pro 2 software is I would merge the HDR software, merge the HDR image, and then go into the filter tool and utilize the Adobe Camera Raw filter to use the clarity tool. And then the other benefit of doing that is you can do that on top of a layer as well, and then you can, adjust using layer masks if you see fit. It's not, of course, it's not exactly the same as using the clarity slider on the raw file, but because we're merging HDR images, I would just sort of advise that we don't mess around with the raw files all that much in most situations. So I just wanted to show you what you could do with a single image exposure. This is a scene where the full dynamic range of the scene basically can be captured with a single image. But I might want to go in and snazz up the image. I might want to use these algorithms that are within HDR Efex Pro to stylize and create a different aesthetic, or in this case, kind of relight the image, right? If you look at the before and after, so here's the original, and here's the enhanced image, I'm directing your attention through the image using texture, using tone, and basically using control points within HDR Efex Pro. So I showed you that before and after. I basically just want to show you how to launch the image into HDR Efex Pro. If I were to, in Photoshop, just click the tone mapping button on this single image, it will launch into HDR Efex Pro and it will make our adjustments for us. But when using HDR Efex Pro within Photoshop, the software does not duplicate the background like it does with the rest of the Nik collection when using Photoshop. So what you need to do if you want to use a separate layer of pixels in HDR Efex Pro is duplicate the background and make your own separate layer. So the quickest and easiest way to do that is just hit Command J on a Mac or Control J on a PC, and that's going to duplicate your background for you. I'm going to go ahead and just name this HDR Efex Pro, the layer itself. And now when I go into HDR Efex, I'll be adjusting on this layer of separate pixels. So I'm not affecting the original background layer, and I can do other stuff. I can utilize other Photoshop sort of workflows. So here's where I might start with a preset. I particularly like the En Vogue ones. Those are presets that I had created and were released in December. No, sorry, not in December, in the latest version of Photo Lab 2. Here is a really stylized representation. I think I'm going to click on Winter Dream. That's pretty close to what we want, or what I want in this case. But I want to actually increase the saturation a little bit. So I need to close down finishing, go into color, and I'm going to increase the saturation back to sort of a normal amount. Now, we are out of time here. It's 8:01, And I know people probably have to hit the road. I'm supposed to have, or I was planning on having a 15-minute Q&A. So I'm going to stick around for a while to try and answer any questions you have, but I'm going to end the webinar now. We kind of missed 5 minutes because of the audio glitch there. I greatly apologize for that. I have no idea what happened, but I'm glad we could get it all back. So let's go ahead and talk shop. If you've got questions, type them into the questions box. I do have a whole bunch in here, so it might take me a while to get back to you. And actually, if you had a question that occurred or that you asked before the audio cut out, please copy and paste that. Ask it again, because it's tough for me to try and go through all of the questions, because I'm not going to be able to find all of them if you asked it 25 minutes ago and we messed up the audio here. Tobin is a real estate photographer. That's what I got there. Kelton, are the numbers, do the numbers equate to f-stops? Yes. So the numbers within the merge dialog, they equate to exposure value changes. So it's not technically exactly the same as camera f-stops, but it does in terms of it translates into stops, if you will. So the +1, 0, +1, +2, those are one-stop changes in exposure value. And they would usually, at least in HDR, probably equate to shutter speed values, but the software just knows it as exposure value. Will we get a copy of this recording? Vit, you should. So the way that this should work is 24 hours after this webinar, a link is going to be sent out to you so that you can rewatch the webinar if you see fit. So Kelton, you said, so a 4 on your image is 4 stops over and 4 stops. Okay, we answered that one. Got it. Okay, we got that one. Excellent example of showing the control points. Thank you. Katie would love to learn more about control points in future webinars. Yes, absolutely. I'd love to describe how control points work. Use them and then come back with specific questions if you can, because they definitely, they're going to work slightly differently for you as you will experience them in a different way, but the technology should work the same. Are you going to post this as a popcast anytime so we can rewatch it? Yeah, Daryl, you should get a link to the webinar at the 24 hours after the webinar ends. So 8 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, you probably should get this, or after, a little bit after that. Good question. So Lewis, so the question is, the masks associated with the control points are not very precise. So I would say depends on how you define precise, right? Because what these control points are trying to do is make a photographic looking selection. So yes, they do bleed out into other areas, but photographically, a lot of times that makes sense. That said, if you wanted to brush the thing in or out, there are definitely techniques using layer masks in Photoshop to be able to brush all of this stuff in and out. And so you can combine the use of control points for this very fast selective capability with a photographic effect with any of your Photoshop selecting and quick mask adjustments. That's something that I find myself doing all of the time. I will make multiple layers of different Nik adjustments, Nik software adjustments using Viveza, and then HDR effects, and then color effects, and maybe another application of color effects of separate adjustments. And I blend them all together using layer masks in Photoshop. Now, if you use Photo Lab 2, you have a combination of control points in Photo Lab 2. We weren't able to discuss that today because we're talking about HDR Efex Pro, but in Photo Lab 2, you have control points which have a lot of these same kinds of controls, but not on an HDR exposure series, on single individual images. And you can combine the control point selective capability with gradient tools, as well as a brush masking tool in Photo Lab 2. All right, hopefully that answers that. When you save the image, will it go back into Photoshop? Yes. I missed most of it because I'm in a different time zone. Oh man, I'm sorry to hear that. Is there a way to review the session? Yes, Marilyn, so since you just logged in, or you just got in a few minutes ago, it looks like, the whole webinar will be sent to you in a link that you'll be able to watch 24 hours after we end the webinar. And it does that because the video basically has to be processed and then posted online. And it is an automated system, so it should just do it itself as fast as possible, but apparently it takes 24 hours. John, when you're working in HDR Efex Pro, you have a 32-bit per channel file. When you exit out of HDR Efex Pro, unless you use the Smart Object capability, you will be dealing with a 16-bit per channel file when you're done processing it. Like it works in 32-bit while you're in here, and then when you go back to Photoshop, it spits out a 16-bit per channel file. Won't using RAW or DNG give a wider range of color when using HDR Efex Pro? Tayo, it kind of depends on what RAW processor you use. So the problem that we run into is that HDR Efex Pro isn't a RAW processing software. It will accept image files like a JPEG or a TIFF file. So those RAW files need to be converted into TIFF files for this to operate properly. But if you've captured your exposure range, it shouldn't be a problem in terms of losing dynamic range or color, because you've created an exposure series that captures all of that. But you're right. Won't using RAW files or DNG files technically give you a wider dynamic range? Technically, yes, but it shouldn't be a problem if you've captured your exposure series to have all of the highlights, midtones, and shadows, and so on. Have you taken one image and produced a series that can be merged in HDR? Charles, great question. So there was a technique that was used from around 2006 until probably 2013. There might actually still be folks that are using this technique, but I don't think you necessarily need to do this anymore, because RAW processing tools are so darn good at allowing you to control the shadows in the highlights within a single exposure. There was a technique, or is a technique, where you process one individual image kind of 3 or 4 times, and basically you bring it into Adobe Camera Raw, and you have a dark version, you have the sort of middle exposure, if you will, like as you captured it, and then you might have a brighter version, and then you merge those 3 images together in HDR Effects. What I found is that these RAW processing tools are so good, you can actually take one single image, tone map it within Adobe Camera Raw, given the situation that the camera can capture the full range of tones in the scene. And then you can do all sorts of stuff in HDR Efex Pro with that image that you've already kind of tone mapped and adjusted within Adobe Camera Raw. That's when using a single image exposure. You can do that, or would do that. How do you sync DxO adjustments before launching HDR Efex Pro? Louis, good question. That one is for another presentation, I think. Excuse me. Thanks for turning me on to control points. Yeah, absolutely, Daryl. They're great. Oh, wow, long question here. In fact, most effects apps, the preset name is not shown on the right side of the screen under tone compression in example. This is very inconvenient when you are trying to keep a record for what your formula in Photoshop. Is there any way to do this without writing on a piece of paper? So, Gary, it sounds like your request is to know which preset that you've clicked on and kind of have that recorded throughout the whole workflow. Is that what you're looking for? I'm sorry, I just want to confirm that. Or maybe you can describe it a little bit. So Wes, you said my control points only have exposure, contrast, saturation, and structure. How do you get the HDR control points? Fantastic question. I think I skipped over that. Here's what you would do. So when using control points, initially your control point will only have exposure, contrast, saturation, and structure. There's actually a little tiny expand collapse box, this little triangle here. If you click on it, it expands that out and you'll have your other adjustment tools as well. I'm sorry if I hastily skipped over that. I get excited about talking about control points, and then I must have skipped that in this case. How do you decide how many exposures you need for a specific photo? And many do the dynamic range of the photo, i.e. blacks and whites? Good question. So Torben, I just watch the histogram on the back of the camera. So usually when I'm shooting an exposure series for HDR, I'm not in a huge hurry, and I'm usually on a tripod, right? So what that means is I can try a bracket of 3 exposures, and if my camera can't capture all of the exposure within 3, I'm usually okay at guesstimating. But what you're looking for is you want the most overexposed image, so the brightest image in your exposure series. If you look at the histogram, you don't want anything pushed up against the left side of the histogram in your most overexposed image. In your most underexposed image, the darkest, you don't want anything in the histogram, any information pushed up against the right side. And if you capture an exposure series that does that, whether it's 3 images that captures the full range, or 5, or 6, or 9, heaven forbid 9, that happens, but most situations you probably won't need that many. You just need to watch the histogram. Now, with modern DSLR and mirrorless cameras, the dynamic ranges are really wide. So you probably aren't going to need 9 exposures in many situations. You probably will only need 3, and you might need 5, but you might need 4. It just completely depends on the situation, and you decide based upon that information in your histograms. Where does one find existing webinar recordings? So Gary, there are a few webinars that are actually posted on the DxO website. So if you go to the nickcollection.dxo.com and you go to past webinars, there are a few here. Oh, my name's spelled wrong. Hughes, that wasn't spelled wrong before, I don't think. And then also you can find the webinars on YouTube. So if you were to go to YouTube and search for the actual Nick software page, you'll find a whole, like, over 100 YouTube videos, many of which are full HDR webinars, and then some of them are short videos, and all of them are all about the Nick collection. All right. So how wide a bracket between frames? Oh, good question too, Peter. So sometimes it depends on your camera, I would say. If you have a camera that was made within the past 2 or 3 years, you could probably get away with 2 stops between each exposure. So you go, 0 to +2 to +4 to +6 if necessary. It does depend upon the camera, and it also might depend upon the lens that you're using. And it's basically comes down to how capable is the sensor within your camera. In the living room scene, there's an object on the right side. Great picture, but what is the object on the right side of the table? Oh, Don, well, let's see if we can go back over. So the object on the right side of the photo, this thing is an old, like, painting and print holder. I think it was meant for an architect. So my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather were both Hudson Valley school painters. My great-grandfather was a faculty member in Philadelphia, as he was a painting professor. And so we had all sorts of this stuff. So some of these are his paintings and some of them are hers. So like this one is my great-grandfather's painting. Actually, this is a picture of mine that my parents put up, which is very sweet of them. And then this is a painting that my great-grandmother did, but on the other side of my family, oddly enough. And I can't paint at all. I probably should practice more. I like painting, just not very good at it. Probably need to do more. When Nick Effects is exported back into Photoshop, the layer is only named for a general preset, such as contrast range. Not the actual preset you chose. Is there any way to get this info ported over? Yeah, Gary, actually, so if you're using at least Color Efex Pro, and you use a preset in Color Efex Pro, the preset that you click on, like, it's not going to show you all of the filters that you've used on that particular image. But if I use, even on a cloudy day, this preset, the file that it generates, the layer that it generates should be named for that preset. Let's see. If I make changes to it, it's not going to do that. But if I just use the preset, so this is even on a cloudy day. I don't know if that's ideal, but let's just look. And this is a full resolution file, of course, which I should have just resed it down so it didn't take so long. And it won't let me go back to the control panel. There we go. Absolutely, Don. Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, we're kind of just, we're coming to the tail end of the Q&A. I don't actually see any more questions If you do have questions, go ahead and type them in here. We do have a couple more minutes. Oh, one more that I missed. What session will best go over how to start from Lightroom for HDR effects and other features? Sarah Finn, so to launch from Lightroom, it actually looks exactly the same as what we did within Photo Lab 2, except what you would do is highlight all of your images in the Lightroom film strip, right click, and then go to export. And the export dialog is going to bring you to the HDR Efex Pro. And actually, Serafin, if you look at, if you go to YouTube and you search HDR Efex Pro Lightroom, there's actually a video that will walk you through that. Are you planning a webinar to show the correct workflow on Nik? Hey, Andre, I'm not sure even show the correct workflow on Nik. So, Andre, are you looking for working with all of the Nik collection, like the right order of operations, if you will? Sandy, you said my images were imported into an app library. I thought the app would work at this demonstration where I choose the image I want to adjust. Why is it doing that, and can I change it? Sandy, I'm not following. I'm sorry. I don't know that one. So Patrick, you said future presentation suggestions: use a single raw image to simulate multi-exposures, then use HDR effects. Yeah, Patrick, that we can do that. I've actually done a little bit of like testing with HDR effects and found that I don't get dramatically different results if I take a single image and process it multiple times and then merge that. What I found is if I do the tone compression on a single image, it basically yields me the same file that I would get, and then I have the exact same capability with an HDR Efex Pro. Anytime your histogram looks like a U bracket is a good idea. Oh, John, I see. So you're talking about technique when shooting. Okay. Cool. Will the software work with older versions of Photoshop? So, Chris, I don't know for sure. I know it'll work with a CC 2018 because I was just using this version on CC 2018, but I can't really answer that question. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that. It probably will work on old versions as long as the Adobe hadn't changed how plugins sort of operate with Photoshop. So if you go too far back, it probably won't work. Like if you were trying to operate with Photoshop 7, you know, like way back, it might not operate. But I think any of the sort of contemporary, the past few years versions of Photoshop, it should work. Oh no. So William, you said you noticed you received at 6 p.m. You tuned in for a few minutes before 6, but it sounds like we're just finishing up, William. I'm sorry. That's odd that it would be listed incorrectly because GoToWebinar just sort of automatically posts the hours. It changes it based upon the time zone that you're logging in from. So if you're in France, it's a completely different time than obviously than here in New York, and for you, it should just automatically do that. I'm sorry you missed it. But William, since you've logged in, you will get an email in about 24 hours with a link to the recorded webinar. So that should be in there. All right, thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Again, my name is Dan Hughes, and I'm going to go ahead and sign off for this HDR Efex Pro webinar, but please join us again whenever you get the opportunity. I have webinars all this month every Wednesday, and I believe Joseph Lanashki's are on Thursdays, if I remember correctly. But definitely check out the email that you probably received to sign up for this webinar, and hopefully I see you again soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.